Hello. Uh, I'm asking myself the question, what am I doing here? Coaching is a dirty word in my world. Closest to it comes what we call brief therapy. And I once went down to Palo Alto to the Mental Research Institute to learn about family therapy, and took a course in brief therapy, which had to do with, we have maximum 4 sessions. During the first sessions, we set goals, and by the end of the 4th session, we will have established the goals. And the team that was doing this, they were all crooks. I mean, they cheated, they lied, they tricked people, and they deeply believed that the end result justifies the means. Later, when I talked to R.D. Laing about various ways of being with people, he kind of chilled my dislike of certain practices, basically saying that the only thing that matters is what happens between 2 people, and it absolutely doesn't matter what the excuse is for the 2 of them to be together. So call it coaching, call it therapy, call it whatever. If you don't call it something, and you don't pretend that you are qualified, then nobody's going to spend time with you. And if the practitioner is loving and attentive, then something marvelous and surprising will happen. So it doesn't matter what we call it. What matters is who you're with. Now, to begin with, one other thing before I get into some of the things which I thought about before I came here, to do with what I heard here. I figure one connection I have with coaching is that that's the only English word that comes from the Hungarian. And that's very interesting because, you know, here I am and here is this word coach and coaching. There's a town in Hungary called Kocs. And around the time when horse-drawn carriages were first invented, in this little town, Kocs, they made very good carriages. And throughout Europe, they were called Kocsi. Kocsi is the thing from Kocs. And so the coach is a carriage. And so that's, as far as I know, the only widely used English word whose origin is Hungarian. Depressing, isn't it? Okay, so I want to paint a bigger picture to do with the use of language. A philosopher by the name of Wittgenstein considered himself a therapist only to the degree, and he said that good philosophy was psychotherapy because most people suffered because of language. Most people suffer because the language they use does not match reality. I mean, I give you an easy example. Just because we can talk about unicorns, and we could talk a lot about unicorns, doesn't mean that the word unicorn refers to anything. And that wouldn't be tragic. However, what is tragic is that today, about 70 years after several people have come up with, there is no such thing as mental illness, we are still using this poor metaphor. It's a very bad metaphor. And it doesn't refer to anything. Thomas Sass, over 50 years ago, clearly showed to anyone who thinks that either there is brain disease or there are problems in living. There is no such thing as mental illness. Yet we go on and on and on talking about mental health, mental illness, blah, 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 refers to nothing. Well, depression is one of those words. I'd like to say, but I won't, that there is no such thing as depression. Well, I guess I said it. Before antidepressants were marketed in the early 60s, late 50s, the word wasn't widely used. People talked about despair, people talked about the blues, people talked about melancholia. So it was an existential condition. People became sad. What's wrong with sadness? But if you want to make money, you invent a drug that people will pay a lot of money for to get rid of an existential condition that just occurs in the world because we are alive, because we are human beings. One of the difficulties that leads to despair is our finiteness, for example. There is nothing to do about it. There is no cure for it. Of all the millions of things I could talk about, like somewhere here is the realm of infinite possibilities, right? But at any one time, I can only say one thing: tragic. Absolutely tragic. Out of an infinite number of possible things, I'm constantly funneling down to one actuality. Boggles the mind. I mean, how... Do you know what I mean? I mean, there was a time I was in an altered state of consciousness. I put pen to paper, and I couldn't move it. I was frozen because I was so aware that I could move that pen any way I liked, but at any one time I could only write one word. But in the realm of possibilities, there were infinite number of words. So every second, including this one, we have to funnel down one actuality from infinite possibilities. Why live? Unless you take it as a challenge. But there are people who, not even fully articulating it like I did, rebel against finiteness and suffer because they are aware of this enormous constriction. One of the discoveries which I made just by listening to the people who come to me was that depression wasn't an illness. It definitely wasn't a brain disease most of the time, like 99% of the time. And that psychology and psychiatry had nothing to do with the whole phenomenon of what we call depression. If a Martian came down and asked me, heard a lot about depression, I'd like to be depressed, what's the recipe? I would give him a formula, or a formula, which goes like, and interestingly, there aren't that many words ending in Asian in English, but the three words are connected here in an equation. I would say oppression plus lack of expression equals depression. Where is the psychology? This is politics and ethics. Politics is the art of accruing and maintaining sufficient power for me to do what I want and not what I don't want. It's not power over. I don't need power over, but power to. the single greatest cause of unhappiness is powerlessness. Not low serotonin. Low serotonin may be the result of powerlessness. But why, planning a chess move, one would examine the molecular structure of the chessboard. Who cares? Who cares about my nervous system? Who cares about my neurotransmitters when my life is impossible, when I'm living the life of a slave, for instance? Wouldn't a slave despair? Especially if its imagination has already failed and can't even imagine that one can live as a free man. So let's look at it in a little more detail. Oppression can be internal or external, but any internal oppression is really internalized others. It was mentioned here before that psychotherapy goes into the future. Not at all. When I am with somebody, I'm losing myself in the here and now unless the past presents itself. And a lot of people suffer because they are actually remembering something without knowing that they are remembering. They think it's in the here and now, when actually a memory is flooding one's consciousness, and one isn't even here. One cannot be here because the past yanks you out of the present, and old events that you could never digest, undigested psychic lumps in your psychic stomach, weigh very heavily and will not allow you to be here. Now, if that happens, then all right, one has to go into the past. But otherwise, really, all one needs to attend to is, are we making a connection or are we not? Are we connecting? Are we not connecting? Not that one should connect, but at least one should be aware of whether one is connecting or not. For example, why I'm saying that's important, and what does that have to do with oppression and lack of expression, therefore depression. Suppose you're making love with somebody. And you can see that the other is totally into it, but you're not quite. So you lose connection. You're actually not connected. But the act is continuing. So what are you doing? You're waiting for it to be over. Well, you're being raped, actually. The moment you're waiting for something to be over, you're enslaved. You lost your freedom. Why didn't you say, hey, I lost connection with you. Where are you? Waiting for something to be over, even this talk, even if you're waiting for me to finish, you're enslaving yourself. There's nothing to wait for except death. There is nothing to wait for except the death of the master. Hegel said, only slaves wait. So when you find yourself living as if you were living at an airport, except there are no flights taking off that you are going to be on, what do people do at airports? They play games, do crossword puzzles, read a trashy book just to pass the time. Well, so-called depressed people, they have their own airport at home, where they are just basically waiting to die, whiling time away because, I don't know, learned helplessness. As I was listening to the enthusiastic coaches, what gladdened my heart is that I would say that they are experienced encouragers. I think they encourage people. In a world where so many people discourage us, we are so often disheartened. Cur is heart, so courage has something to do with heartening versus disheartening. So my mother, if I didn't behave like she thought I should, she would say something like, "This is not my Andrew. Where is my Andrew?" And it kind of screwed with my mind. I was looking, where is her Andrew? But that's an example. It takes this little to make a family into a theatrical family, not a dramatic family. My mother was, she was a movie director, and I was one of the actors in her movie. So she made me self-conscious because she had a scheme. She knew how her Andrew should behave, how her Andrew should be. And she gave me every day a dozen clues as to how to play her son. Now, I thought for a while in my life that what we were most afraid of, human beings, was death. That isn't true. I learned, people who came to see me have taught me, what we are most afraid of is the loss of love. Worse than death. So, as children, we are in no position to risk losing our parents' love. We're just in no position whatsoever. So when the parent gives theatrical clues as to how to play their son or their daughter, you either comply or you rebel. Actually, it turns out that rebelling doesn't save your bacon either. Because both rebellion and compliance are reactions to pressure. Right? And authentic self has no time to manifest. So you're sitting on yourself somewhere, you have hidden yourself. There is some kind of inner sanctum where you hopefully can keep yourself in the beginning hoping that this will pass. But by the time you're 20 or 30 or 40, you're beginning to realize it's not passing. Because after having to play the good child of your parents, you have to play the good student in school, then you have to play the good lover of your lover, then you have to play the good spouse of your spouse, then you have to play the good parent, and then if you get into psychotherapy, in most cases, you have to play the good patient to the man who is playing the good therapist. So the show goes on, you're trapped in a 24/7 soap opera. Can you imagine? You were born on stage. 24/7, there is no break. You can't get off stage. Now, if that's not depressing, what is? No wonder that people think the only way out is to kill yourself. Right? The moment you kill yourself, you're off stage. You don't have to be the good son, you don't have to be the good daughter, you don't have to be the good businessman. You're done. You say one big no to everybody, and here is the best part, you don't have to stick around for the consequences. Right? Who can beat that? Well, I can. Because I suggested to many people who were at this point that, why kill yourself? You'll die anyways. So before that happens, why not put your ID, a passport, a driver's license in your jeans pocket, go down around 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock to the beach, throw your pants into the water with the ID, and take the next flight to Rio de Janeiro, where you take an assumed name, and you're as good as dead, because everybody will think when they fish out your pants with your ID that you must have committed suicide, right? Nobody's even going to look for you. And you start a fresh life in Rio or wherever you want to go, and no consequences, right? So when people some people don't take the offer. Some people say, I'd rather kill myself. Well, what can you do? You can't win them all. But, I'm a pessimist, and that's why I'm mostly happy. I expect everything to go wrong. I'm wondering that, I'm surprised that this many people can be together without anybody being killed. I mean, why aren't we screaming? Life is really awful. The ancient Greeks used to say that only stupid people live, because the smart ones kill themselves as soon as they realize what life is about. I mean, just because your mom and dad had a fuck and precipitated you into this world, does that mean that you have to live? Now you're stuck with it? That's like Aladdin's lamp. They rubbed it, and bang, you are here. You have to be grateful? So a lot of us are reluctant livers. Even if you haven't thought this through, most people don't think things through. It's worth thinking things through, and maybe that's what a good coach can do, helps you think things through. Okay, so I didn't ask to be born. They rubbed Aladdin's lamp. Here I am. You can tell who is a reluctant liver. They complain. People who complain are reluctant livers. You can tell. Very easy. So when reluctant livers come to see me, I say, look, go to a place where in a 10-mile radius there is no one, no living creatures. Don't take any radio, don't take any music. Take a guitar if you play guitar or a harmonica or something. So take stuff that you can express yourself with. Take paper and pen, but don't take books. Take enough food that will last you for 10 days or 14 days. And take a weapon with which you could kill yourself. A gun, razor blades, whatever, rope. And think about it. Kill yourself, but if you come back and I see you again, then you can't be a reluctant liver anymore. Then you have chosen life. And you aren't here just because your mother and father had a fuck. So far, I have an impeccable record. So far, everyone has come back. And you can tell people who have seriously contemplated suicide because they don't complain. What's there to complain about? I personally am interested in making the best of a bad thing. So because I'm a pessimist, I know that life is suffering. Like the Buddha said, life is suffering. R.D. Laing was already quoted that the only suffering we could do without is the suffering to avoid the unavoidable suffering. So accept it. It sucks. However, just like in contract bridge, I don't know if any of you play bridge, but those who do know that just because you get a bad hand doesn't mean that you can't win. Because bridge is about making the best of the hand that you're dealt with. It's not just a game of luck. It's a game of how to bring the best out of a bad hand. And I think one can change one's attitude to living, except be a realist. Stop this hatred of reality. It doesn't pay to hate reality. I mean, you might as well accept it for what it is, and rather than run headlong into a wall, because it shouldn't be there, Notice it's there. And don't run into it, but start looking right and start looking left, see where there may be chinks in the wall, see if there is a door somewhere, see if you can climb over it somewhere. Yeah, accept it and make the best of it. Then life can be fun. In Hungary, before 1956, when I escaped from there, the whole country was depressed. Again, it wasn't a psychological event, it was political. Hungary has a history of having been oppressed. They have been oppressed by the Austrians, they have been oppressed by the Turks, they have been oppressed by the Russians, you name it. The national anthem of Hungary says, we have suffered enough, so dear God, send us some good times. So before 56, everyone was crying into their beer. People were silent and in despair because we weren't free. We were oppressed politically, and if anyone said anything about it, the secret police would arrive 3 or 4 in the morning, and you could end up in Siberia, or no one ever heard of you again, just because somebody overheard you say something against the then present regime. So there was no expression. The walls had ears. Everybody was silent. Everybody was depressed. So Depression Confessions appealed to me because at least there is a possibility for expression. So even if there is oppression, if you can express yourself, you can't continue being as depressed as before you expressed yourself. Now, the monumental contribution, and I would say it's a paradigm shift. What was a paradigm shift, for example, was up to a certain point we believed that the Earth the sun was going around the Earth, and then somebody said, hey, it's the other way around. Now, between the first time that somebody realized that the Earth was going around the sun and the time when it was finally accepted, it was 1,200 years. That's how conservative we are. I can't say we are stupid. We are not stupid. We are conservative. Right? People had a stake in believing that we were the center of the world. People had a stake in believing that the sun was going around the Earth. And it took 1,200 years to realize and not burn at the stakes or excommunicate those who said, no, no, it's the other way around. So, R.D. Laing, in mid-50s, early 60s, made a point to his fellow psychiatrists, who, by the way, they called him an anti-psychiatrist, but he himself called himself a true psychiatrist. He thought the others were anti-psychiatrists. Why? Because the Hippocratic Oath says, do no harm. Notice, it doesn't say do good. It just says do no harm, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So please don't have any. Just try not to make people's life worse by your presence than it would have been without it. That's the Hippocratic Oath. And according to Laing, the majority of psychiatrists do harm to the people who seek them out. So he said, the problem, when problem manifests, whether it's depression, psychosis, schizophrenia, manic depressive, whatever, the problem is always between us, not within a person. Now, if you think this one through, nobody believes. It's like in present-day psychiatry, psychology, Lang is passé. We heard it, didn't work, forget him. Well, maybe 1,000 years from now, we'll realize that he was right. He was the first one who said, the psychiatrist or the therapist contributes to the suffering of the patient. That whatever is going on is between all the time. It's between parent and child. It's between the parents. It's between the therapist and the patient. Never within one or the other. So, the conclusion is, nobody suffers unless that person has been hurt. Now here, it's a good idea not to go into the past. So the previous generation has heavy stakes in not questioning who did what to whom. Sartre and Lang together came up with this existential idea of demystification. Because many people talk like, this happened, and that happened, and that happened, and this happened. And Lang and Sartre said, nothing ever happens. It's always somebody doing something to somebody. So who did what to whom is an enlightening and important question. What happened covers over the truth, mystifies. So, all the psychiatric diagnoses, including anxiety, depression, whatever you have, is a result of somebody having hurt somebody. Now, those who hurt the somebody who has been hurt, the victim, is always a witness to the deed, right? And you know from all the crime dramas that witnesses need to be killed or driven mad. But the best witness is a dead witness. So the problem about having been the recipient of abuse is that if you start talking about it, everybody around you wants you dead. So who wants that? So let's forget about who did what to whom, and let's pretend I have a neurological disorder. Let's pretend I have a brain disease. Let's take drugs. Do not examine how we treat each other or how you have been treated. Lang said the treatment is how we treat each other. It's not expertise. No, I once thought that medical school for psychiatrists is really a school for theater. It's a theater school. They teach a man to act like a psychiatrist, to act like someone who knows. Very few people in my life did I hear say what to do when you don't know what to do. If a doctor says that, would win my respect, but in medical school you're trained not ever to say that. A psychiatrist can't say, I have no idea what's going on. So, I think that it's very, very difficult to give up transference. Transference is, originally, as children, we all thought that our parents knew. I remember being little, looking up at my parents, thinking that they are all-knowing, all-powerful. I remember once I asked my mother to please tell the wind to stop blowing, because I could hardly breathe. Well, it's very hard to give up that notion that there is always someone who knows. The end of transference, Freud said, is when the patient realizes that the patient knows as well as the therapist. So when they both know, the end of transference for a child is when the child grows up and the child knows every bit as much as the parents know. When everybody knows, that's the end of transference. But Jacques Lacan, the French Freud, said, no, even Freud was too frightened to realize the truth. The truth being that nobody knows. Nobody knows. Nobody knows anything except technologically, but not in the things that we are interested in. Nobody knows. There was some talk here about, I think it was Dan who was supposed to be feeling strange because he didn't have the experience of depression. But, you know, we are such sloppy thinkers. Nobody knows anything about the other. Like even, if that was true, that somehow we need to have similar experiences, if we have to be the same, then only men could work with men, only women could work with women, only black people could work with black people, only lesbians with lesbians. Like nonsense. If I meet somebody who is the same age as I am and was born in the next apartment where I was born in Budapest, exactly at the same time I was, grew up in the same culture, we speak the same language, do you know what? Even then, that person is infinitely other than I am. It's just that the reminders of infinite otherness are not so clear. So when I meet somebody in therapy, I have to forget everything I ever thought I knew. The moment I look at that person as one of them, that was another thing Lang said, there is no us and them. There's only us. We are all in the same boat. The worst has happened to all of us, therapist, patient alike. So he defined therapy as two people's desperate attempt to regain the fullness of their humanness by relating, by attempting to relate decently to each other. I would say as long as somebody is candid and spontaneous, conversation with that person would be exciting. We heard that an experienced coach's ear perks up when the conversation begins to be a little bit boring. And rightly so, because a conversation can only be boring when at least one of the two people who are conversing is not candid and spontaneous. We constantly surprise each other without even trying if we allow ourselves to be candid and spontaneous. A relationship, even if it's 20, 30, 40 years old, there is still a learning curve. You can never learn enough about the other. But if you pretend that you know everything, the learning curve flattens out and everything becomes boring. But it's dangerous to be candid and spontaneous. You might lose the love of the other. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Now, if that isn't good for a depression, what is? There are two doors out, and there is death awaiting you at both doors. What are you going to do? Well, I'll just give you another perspective that somehow there are patterns that influence us. I would say that Lang once told me that when he felt depressed, everything seemed hopeless, everything seemed dark, everything seemed heavy and difficult. And then something would happen, and he would say the depression lifted, And everything was colorful, everything was easy. Nothing changed in the world. But how he was in it felt very different. Now, to me, one language, one way of speaking about that would be that one can flip in and out of certain states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness, which some people explore with the use of psychedelics or plant medicines or psychiatric medications. But sometimes states of consciousness flip without there being traceable reasons for why suddenly I am here and now I am here, and how hard it is to work my way back up here once I fell down here. In mathematics, there is a whole theory around discontinuities that you find called catastrophe theory. That's the name in mathematics, in pure mathematics. Catastrophe theory, you can sort of calculate what happens when you come to the edge of something and suddenly you find yourself in a whole different world. So I have a TED talk where I talk about the state of consciousness of shame and the state of consciousness of love. And although you couldn't go from shame into love, when you are in shame, it seems impossible. When you are in love, you don't understand what your experience was in shame. Totally discontinuous states of consciousness. So one thing I would play with, if this kind of thing would plague me, is I'm a very curious man, so I would like to participate in every state of consciousness that is available to a human being. From St. Vitus dance, where you move every muscle, you're dancing without stop in total excitement, all the way to samadhi, where you're relaxed so that you're hardly breathing. And everything else in between. What we call normal state of consciousness is a little bit right here in the middle of this rainbow of human consciousness. So I don't see any virtue in staying in this little bit where you can drive cars and manufacture cigarettes, because you need normal state of consciousness to do some of those things. But I think it would be very useful, and I certainly have done my part, to explore all these and all these states of consciousnesses. The trouble is when you get into one and you feel like you can't get out. So one of the worst parts of that state of consciousness that normally we refer to as depression is the feeling that you're stuck in it, that you can't come out. If you could dip into it and come back, it would be so much better. Who would want to dip into it? But there are certain things that you can only learn in that state of consciousness. Certain creativity. I have a whole bunch that I wrote down but won't have time to talk about Abraham Lincoln, who all his life was depressed. And yet he transformed his life from everything that he suffered in his depression. He became an agent of change. Interestingly, he was a champion of freeing black slaves. So this formula he was somewhere aware of, that depression is oppression plus lack of expression. So he fought for the freedom of others. And by participating in something larger than himself, he managed the state of consciousness that he was in. Lang once said to me that if you're not melancholy, you're insane. Insanity being out of touch with reality. Like if you're in touch with reality, every moment is the last of its kind. Like we are all hurtling to death. There is no exception. Nothing will save you. You can't hold on to anything. Right? Like, how could you not be melancholy? Really, like you would have to be out of touch with reality. So anybody who is ha ha ha, happy, happy, is crazy. That's what I call crazy. Well, I said enough, I hope, to inspire some questions. And if you, what I would like, in Hungary, where I do a lot of speaking, it really works well, is if you really want to ask me a question, come here, sit down, and I'll talk with you, and they can listen in. So much better than asking a question from there. But if you insist and ask me from there, I'll answer, but reluctantly. So come up and I'll talk with you. Hi.
Ian. Nice to meet you. So my question's about, you said something about power. You said searching, or the lack of power is the greatest, what was it?
Unhappiness is a result of powerlessness.
Right, so is having a goal to attain power a noble and a useful goal to have?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I said, not power over. I don't ever want to have power over anybody, but I don't want anybody to have power over me.
But they do.
Well, up to a certain point. Why do you think I went to university? Not because I can use any of the stuff that they taught me, right? It's absolutely useless. I went there to pass all the exams that I needed in order to get my credentials so I can practice. So it was a power move. It wasn't an educational move.
Cool.
By the way, courage, you're not born with courage. You can practice courage, and this is a good place to practice it. You know, you're not born with being able to play the piano, but you can practice it. Courage can be practiced. Every time you want to do something and you feel fear, do it anyways. So if you want to come here, come, regardless of what you are feeling. Who cares about feelings anyways?
I have a question. I know a lot of people that have entered, the coaching world, and what would you tell us or them about what we can bring to people who are helpless, hopeless, that sort of thing? How would you advise us?
What you're doing? I think what seems obvious to me, and correct me if I'm wrong. You take the person who comes to you. You take that person seriously. Now that alone is rare. Most of us suffer because from the moment we were born, we weren't taken seriously. Yeah. I would say all abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, the root cause is not being taken seriously. Every child says no, and the no is ignored. So as a coach, you take people seriously. So that's already healing. They can't believe their eyes. Here is a man who takes me seriously. Why don't they know what they want? Because they have never taken themselves seriously. How would I know I can take myself seriously if no one ever has? So that alone, that you just take the person seriously. And it's interesting, you say you ask a lot of questions. I sometimes pride myself on not asking any questions. Because even questions, could be coercive. Like, just because you ask me a question, I don't have to answer. Like, fuck off with all your questions. Wait until I tell you what comes up. But if you do it lovingly, then even your intrusiveness by asking questions, and you sort of have the mandate of the person who came for coaching, so you're not stopping somebody on the street and start asking them questions. So you're not, I think you're encouraging people. There isn't that much, I think, one human being can do for another. We can give shelter, we can encourage each other, and we can demystify. That's about it. And by shelter, I mean give a space where you can play. Give a space where you don't have to be afraid. Give a space where you are allowed to be and let be. So you do that, you encourage people, and you demystify. You wait until they, for the first time, maybe listen to the silence of their own heart and actually cough up what they desire.
I think I'm understanding more about the efficacy of coaching from Andrew than I did about, through the program that I was through.
But you have your credentials.
Come on, you guys. Another couple of questions. Whoa, what's going on here? Thanks, Andrew.
I have a question about courage.
Put it close.
Oh, sorry. I have a question about courage. I think I already had a brief conversation with you before you came up here. I've overcome lots of fear-based reactions to things, with the exception of one. And I can't dance publicly, and I want to dance before I die. I know that you have done some experimentation and research with the use of MDMA in overcoming areas of shame, and I think it ties in nicely with dancing. As I understand, it's also used at raves and music festivals. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your research, how it's been helpful, what its limitations are, that sort of thing.
Okay. I asked R.D. Lang once what his favorite drug was, and he, like many other curious people, he tried everything there is. And his answer was MDMA. And I asked him, which at that time was called Adam. Later it was called ecstasy, and now we refer to it as MDMA. He said, because it opens the heart. Actually, the experience of MDMA does three things. It opens your heart, it presents you, it makes it absolutely clear that the future is opaque. Anything you think about the future is fantasy. We can never, ever know anything about the future, so why even hang out there? The past has already been done, finished, nothing you can do there, so it allows you to be present, sometimes for the first time. And the third one is, you know, while it lasts, what it feels like to have no shame. And people are very surprised because shame is like ask a fish about water, and the fish says, what water? And ask most people about shame, they don't even know it. They swim in it. Most of us have been brought up in shame. When my mother said to me, what's the matter with you? She was shaming me. Because if she would have said, don't do that, I might have felt guilty, but not ashamed. Feeling ashamed, it comes from my whole being. There is something wrong with it. It goes right to the roots of my being. Now, interesting thing is, I think a generation of children could be raised without them ever being shamed. But again, we are not interested. After the 3-year war in Sarajevo, the United Nations asked me to go there and help deal with the traumatized children because of the war. I found that the children weren't traumatized at all. because their mothers took very good care of them. And in their small world, they were sheltered from the horrors of the war. However, what was of danger to them was their school system, where they would be singled out if they made a mistake and put in the corner with a dunce hat, and everybody was spitting on them or pointing at them, public shaming. Like, there is nothing worse. Shame to the soul is like a red-hot branding iron to the body. And you want to avoid it for the rest of your life. Avoidance learning is one trial learning. For our survival, you put your hand in fire, you never want to put your hand in fire again. So shame is that kind. So once you have been shamed, you have no idea of how cleverly you're trying to avoid situations where you can be shamed. So at a certain point, you simply have to go against the grain. Now, what MDMA helps to do is between you, because I said it's between people. The problem is that once you have been shamed, once you have been hurt, once you have not been taken seriously, once you have been betrayed, because that's the proper word, I think many of us have been deeply betrayed in our family of origin. And so we expect to be betrayed. And we expect to be shamed. That's part of our psychology, that whatever happened will happen again. I would say as a general rule, whatever you're afraid of has already happened. You can't be afraid of something that never happened. In some form, we project ahead what has already happened. So, what can you do except whoever you are surrounded with, it reminds you of someone who made fun of you. It reminds you of someone who made you feel like a fool when you made a mistake. So you never, ever want to make that kind of mistake publicly again. Well, I think the remedy may be find one person you feel comfortable with, one person you can play with, and then go public and risk and imagine everybody's going to laugh at you. There are some First Nations people who every year they use cochina dolls to remind each other that we are all fools, so don't even try not to look foolish. Like, it's given. We are all making fools of ourselves. Even me, as I'm sitting here telling you all this. I'm just a foolish old man. So what have you got to lose if you started to dance?
Well, I guess that was my question, is if, I mean, even though you can say it, intellectualize it, think it, if you're still blocked, I guess that was my question, is MDMA useful? You're saying that MDMA in the right circumstance is useful in opening your...
Yes, that's what the research shows.
Okay.
In many countries, you know, there are some smart countries like Portugal and Norway. Right now, the government says, not psychiatrists, not psychologists, the government says all drugs are legal, you do whatever you like, whoever you do it with. The problem is never with the drug, whether it's heroin or MDMA, all drugs. So, you know, travel to one of those two countries. And you can do but take someone with you, because the magic is not in the drug. The drug just opens up the possibility that whoever you are with is not like your father was, not like your mother was, not like a teacher was, but this person, you can actually, because you're open-hearted, if the other person is also open-hearted and loving, then you realize that the shaming will not repeat itself. So it's not the drug alone, it's also you need a companion.
Are you able to remember
Yes.
that pathway past the
Yes,
shame
yes, yes.
after the MDMA?
Nobody I know needed MDMA therapy for longer than about half a dozen sessions, Because MDMA is not like LSD. LSD has state-specific memory, like alcohol. So you have to get as drunk as you were before you remember what you did when you were drunk. In between, you don't remember. Same with LSD, but with MDMA, you carry it in your ordinary state of consciousness. So you learn not to be ashamed, you learn to be open-hearted, and you learn to be present.
Thank you.
Welcome. Hi.
This is a little bit terrifying.
Little bit.
Little bit.
You'll get used to it.
My question for you, and one of the things I've been working through now after dealing with recurrent depression for over 30 years, it finally came off the rails for me really in August, and I was hospitalized, and I've been subject to a lot of viewpoints, either from friends, family, have seen multiple psychiatrists, through the mill of the system, and therapists, and it's led to a feeling of the reality of wellness being a little bit flexible or malleable, because everybody's coming at it with a different viewpoint and different things that I should be doing or taking or practices that I should be involved in. It's difficult to reconcile all that.
For sure.
And with a compromised mind that's telling me I want to die, or I'm existentially unhappy, or maybe it's genetics, maybe it's biology, or whatever it is. My question is, how can I orient to all those different viewpoints?
Don't even try.
Okay.
I think that one of the difficulties in present day the therapeutic culture is that everybody is eager to teach you their language. Jungians will teach you speak Jungian, Freudians Freudian, different schools, different vocabulary. So it's like learning a second language, when actually it could be that you are in despair because you never learned your own, and there was no one paying you enough attention to learn your language. What you need is somebody whom you can teach about you, not somebody who can teach you about the world. So I think that somebody, see, even if the problem is biological, there is a neurologist by the name of Oliver Sacks, who wrote many books. He actually worked with brain-damaged people. But the work and the trouble that he went to deal with the physiology and the brain stuff was minuscule in comparison to how much attention he paid to the person that he was with. So much, and what he was helpful with is help the person to accept himself as he is, in his isness. Love yourself, accept yourself, don't try to change yourself. Love has no agenda, right? All agendas out the window. And start looking at what environment, human and otherwise, would compensate you for who you are. So don't change yourself, change your environment, change the people. Find people in whose company you feel good about yourself. You may not even know. Like if you happen to grow up among people in whose company it's impossible to feel good about yourself, then you think all of humanity is like that, when it isn't. So he helped people with physical and other kinds of environments so that their disability wouldn't show. You know, rather than work on their disability, he worked on the environment. And I think that's a good way to go. So find someone who loves you enough to take delight in you as you are. And hopefully that will infect you so that you will start taking delight in yourself as you are. And if there are difficulties, then look around and ask yourself, what kind of people would you like to hang out with? What country? What climate? What would you like to do to compensate for who you are? You don't have to excel and be happy on top of a garbage dump. No? Sometimes when you listen to Western psychiatry, they want to adjust you to a sick world instead of helping you to create a good world, even if just a mini world, in which you can survive.
Yeah, it feels sometimes more like treating the symptoms than...
Yeah. So, you know, I'd have to get to know you far more before I could give you practical suggestions. But to begin with, I think Western psychology is prison psychology. Accept your circumstances and adjust yourself. Work on yourself. Eastern psychology, Buddhist psychology, is accept yourself. Don't do violence to yourself. Don't try to improve yourself. You're perfect as you are. Work on your environment. Don't work on yourself.
So then, just from a real pragmatic point of view, then, for that first step of finding folks that can teach me my language.
No, who can learn your language.
Can learn my language. Like,
It may mean to be silent for a long time until you find your words. So what were you going to ask?
just like, where's my people?
Well, look, often what happens is there comes this point late in therapy, you come to it very early, where people say, okay, so I can do it with you, meaning me, but where are people like you? So it's like Lang used to say, the finger points to the moon, and the patient says, what an interesting finger, let me suck it. So you have to go out into the world. Like in Hungarian fairy tales, the youngest son, there comes a moment where he has to go out into the world, slay the seven-headed dragon, do some things in the world, then come back, then he gets the princess and half the kingdom. Well, go out into the world. I don't know. Don't stop until you find people that you want to spend time with rather than run away from.
That's some good advice. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so this will be the last question. I think we have to stop at 5.
Okay, you talked about what you think is very valuable in life is the range of emotion, and you would like to experience all of that. Why do you think that's important?
Oh, I was just talking about myself. I'm curious. I wouldn't prescribe it. I just think, it was kind of thinking about that partly why people suffer in what they call depression is because they are stuck in it, because it has a no exit feeling. And I just like to stretch walls, go through walls, find doors. I don't like to feel stuck. I wouldn't like to feel stuck being happy all the time either.
How come?
Well, it's boring. No, as somebody mentioned before, I think human nature is such that if you really want to go high, you have to go really low, and then you can go high. You limit your lows, you can't get the highs.
Is that true, or are we just telling ourselves that because when we're low,
No.
we want to believe that we can?
No, that's my experience. I mean, I may be wrong. You know, certainty is a tone of voice, and what do I know?
I think you know a lot.
Well, thank you.
All right. One more thing. You talked before about 2 doors, and behind both doors was death. So what are we supposed to do? Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Well, call for help. Well, look, suppose you are in your mother's womb, And at first, all is well. Stanislav Grof, who did a lot of LSD research, calls the first phase bliss inside. I mean, what could be more blissful? You have continuous income through the umbilical cord. You have lots of room. You can play with yourself, whatever. What else? You know. But then you grow, and it becomes uncomfortable, and suddenly you don't have enough oxygen. And so let's call the fear of life the fear of the unknown, right? Because you know something got to change, because you feel, even though you don't have words, you feel, if I don't get out of here, I'll die inside. And you would if you didn't get out. It's usually the fetus who gives the signal for birth. So it so happens that the fear of life, the fear of the unknown, is constant. The fear of dying inside grows slowly as you run out of space and oxygen and nourishment, right? The moment the fear of dying inside is greater than the fear of the unknown, you give the signal. Because dying maybe is better than dying for sure. And I think it comes to that in our lives. When you feel, if I don't make a change, I'll die in here for sure, then go for die maybe.